Welcome back to PES Maastricht Podcast. I'm Simona and I'm here today again with my colleague Gwennie. How are you, Gwennie?
I'm good, thank you, Simona. I'm actually really excited about today's episode as we have a fantastic guest that will be introduced by Simona later on. And as we talked about this semester about social security and defense, I think this is super interesting and highly relevant today.
Yeah, we're very happy to welcome our guest today. She's a Jean Monnet professor and the chair in administrative governance at Maastricht University. She's an expert on the common foreign and security policy and has spent years researching how the EU has adapted to crisis. So we're very happy to welcome with us today Professor Sophie Vanhoonacker.
Yeah,
I hope I
right.
pronounced
Yes,
it great.
that's right.
Yeah. How are you, Sophie? Nice.
Fine, thank you. And thanks for having me today.
Yes, of course. It's a pleasure for us. Yeah.
So first of all, we wanted to touch up on, I think, a broad understood topic at the moment, as it's come all over the news. So it's about basically NATO's defense spending targets, as they have said that they want to reach a 5%. However, you gave a comment on that it's not only about this percentage, but that it's also mainly about the independence that Europe is trying to build up in this defense strategy. How do you see this? And do you think we're going with this the right way? And if you would want to give this a score out of 1 to 10, is it 10 the best that we could and 1 horrible? Where are we right now?
Well, I think a very interesting question. I think indeed there is still a lot to be done for Europe to become more strategically autonomous in the field of defense, as we call it. And because for most of its history, the European countries have really been together with the US in NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance. So if you ask me for a score, I would say for the moment it's a 6 probably, or perhaps a 6.5. And the reason for this is that, well, I think we still have a lot of deficiencies in the capabilities. And then I'm primarily thinking about, for example, military intelligence. We see how important this is now in Ukraine. And there we really very much still depend on the US. The same for the satellites. We depend on Elon Musk's satellites. We also have a shortage of ammunition. So that was really a wake-up call again. Also drone technology. We see that Ukraine is developing very fast in this area. But when there were drones entering the EU territory, well, we did not have the appropriate responses. So I think still a lot of work. But perhaps on the positive side, you can say that, well, things are starting to move at least. And so the war in Ukraine, of course, and also the second Trump administrations have been playing major roles in all of that.
And then do you think that this 5% target, that this is the right way to go? Or do you think...
Well, yeah, I think it's, as I said indeed before, it's not just about percentages.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot of money. You sometimes wonder, do we have to spend all this money? I think the most important, I'm afraid personally that there will be a waste. And that, now we are, there is a need really for coordination and make sure that we do not fragment. So we really have to make sure that we are doing this, looking what are the gaps, but how can we spend the money wisely and in the most effective way. And there is a risk now because there is so much money put on the table.
And pressure maybe as well.
Yeah. So, but it's true, we have to do something, we have to invest. But my main plea would be, well, invest it wisely and work together so that you avoid this fragmentation and also make sure that the capabilities you're developing are interoperable.
Yeah,
so that is very important,
Collective work is always for the better.
Yeah.
And touching upon, we wanted to also ask you regarding your research on the General Secretariat of Council and the AS. For those of us who aren't like Brussels bubble, I would say, experts, we often hear about presidents and high representatives, but your work shines a light on the official in the shadows, we would say. So why does the administrative side, the civil servants, matter so much when we talk about something as high stakes as European defense, in your opinion?
Oh, thank you again. A very interesting question. that goes to the heart of my research. Indeed, of course, what you see in the news, on television, social media, it's very much the political level, which they are of course crucial, because in the end they take the decisions, and of course they are accountable to the broader public because they are elected. But of course, politicians could not function without the work done by the civil servants and the diplomats, who are working indeed more behind the scenes. But their work is indispensable. And what the two main contributions of civil servants and diplomats is, on the one hand, that they are there for the longer term. So normally they have permanent contracts, so they can have the long-term perspective, whereas politicians come and go. But they are an important factor of stability. And I think it's also interesting to see that the Trump administration is sacking a lot of civil servants, because you don't have these long-term views then, and policies become much more ad hoc. And second contribution, and there again we see issues in the current Trump administration, civil servants and diplomats provide expertise. And so they have the knowledge. If you want to make good policies, you have to base them on facts and figures, on knowledge. But there are also certain routines, certain ways of doing things. And so we talk about standard operating procedures. And so these have been developed over the years. And so when something happens, an administration knows how to handle this. But if you do away with all of this, well, then I'm afraid you get chaos and you get poor quality decisions.
Yeah, it's always better to think more in the long term, whereas to the short. Yeah.
And rely on people who know something about the topic. Of course, in the end, the decision is always with the politician, because the politician is elected and the civil servant isn't. But they are a very important part of policy making, and good policy making, I would say.
So in your opinion, it's important to be democratically elected, for sure, right?
Yeah, it's crucial.
Yeah.
So
we can see the difference. Yeah.
But would you say that, for example, the elected people are basically the face of the officials in the back?
Yeah, well, they are more than the face, because they can also make the choices. And so the civil servants will come with different options. And so because there is never, or rarely, I would say, one answer to a policy problem. But then a good bureaucrat or diplomat will say, well, these are the options on the table, and also will come with arguments why this is a good option. And then, of course, the politicians will make the choice, because they are accountable to Parliament and to the citizens. But of course, they can take better decisions if they rely on the work of people who have been doing this job for many more years, and who will also, they don't have the time, the politicians do not have the time to research everything, or they have to act quickly. And it tremendously helps if they have, let's say, on a plate the different options. And then they say, okay, this is important because my citizens, my electorate also finds this important. So I think you need both, and they need to interact closely together.
And when there is a connection, the work goes much more smooth.
Yeah, indeed.
And then I have one more follow-up question. Do you think that in the political state we're in right now, there is a lack of them working together in certain places? What you mentioned before, for example, Trump?
Yes, and so in the European Union, of course, we have this, people sometimes complain about the bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy, of course, there is always a risk of too many rules and so on. But at the same time, they play also a very positive role. Yeah. And I think the Trump administration shows what happens if you don't work, for example, with professional diplomats. I think it's part of the problem at the moment in the negotiations with Iran. If you send somebody like Witkoff, who is not a professional diplomat and who is also not so interested to work with professional diplomats, well, then this is really a problem. Yeah. So, I think it's now we see, because as one of you was saying, the work of diplomats and civil servants is often invisible. Yeah. So, but the moment they are not there anymore, then you see how important what is missing. And I think it's a little bit with Brexit. People were always complaining about the EU, and then all of a sudden the UK was no longer a member, but now they realize what the EU was doing for them. Exactly. But you only can make sometimes the point if something disappears.
Yeah, and I think that could also be for the public because they're misinformed, right? Because they're only presented what you said by this face. Well, it's much more, but by this face of a party or whatever political thing. So they vote based on that. And they don't realize, I think, the backbone that is needed to support this. And then we get situations like the UK where they're all actually very unhappy right now with the state of it.
Yeah.
But I think how would you advise for maybe just normal people to become more aware of the whole interconnectable strategies going on there and not just relying on the bigger picture that's being brought on TV?
Yeah, that's of course
yeah.
challenging because everybody has their own job to do. But I think it is important, perhaps, quite some lessons can be learned from the current situation.
Yes.
Both as a result of Brexit, both as a result of an administration that actually despises civil servants. And so they have also been, they are not only working with professional diplomats, they have also been sending administrations home. And I think now the public sees, at least those who want to inform themselves, they see what the consequences are. Also, when it comes to vaccine policy in the US and so on. Well, at a certain moment, people will be dying,
I think that would raise enough awareness. Yes.
Yeah.
And then moving forward, you've also been working on a REMIT project, if I pronounce it like that correctly, which looks at global tech governance.
Yes.
And this is a highly, of course, current topic as we're making massive growth in a really, really short time. How does tech governance fit into basically our team of security? And is this becoming something we should focus on, as this could be a front line of the European defense strategies?
Yes, definitely. So I'm indeed involved in this project, Horizon project of the European Commission, led by Roberta Hart from UCM.
Yeah.
And so we are looking at indeed the governance and the role of multilateral institutions in the governance of strategic technologies like AI, for example. And this is a very topical issue. And indeed, as you are saying, there is a very clear link with security, because what we see that, of course, AI, for example, can bring a lot of positive issues, but there are also risks. And what we see that, the US has, of course, been developing a lot of these technologies. They have, of course, big tech companies. And we have been relying very much on this. And so far, this was all well. But now what we see that these strategic technologies are used as an instrument of power and also coercion. So they actually put a lot we are now realizing that at a certain moment, the US is in a very powerful position to say, well, we don't give you access to certain technologies anymore. Yeah. And so the EU is now also realizing this. And one of the issues is also that we have quite a different view on how to regulate and to govern these strategic technologies. And so if you look at the AI Act, which has now entered into force since last year, this AI Act, the EU says, AI brings a lot of good things, but we also have to regulate and we have to protect our citizens. And so we have also to make sure that human rights are respected, and we have to also protect the privacy of our citizens. And face recognition should not be allowed. So that's, personally, I think it's a very positive view. Of course, some have been saying, perhaps we are too protective and we do not leave enough scope for innovation. So there has been quite a lot of pressure also from companies in the European Union. So, but the US takes a totally different approach, and so they are not interested in regulating AI and other strategic technologies, because, or at least only to a limited extent, because they think, we should leave a lot of space for innovation, and so it's also not by accident that a lot of the big tech firms have been supporting the Trump administration, because they thought, Trump will not push us towards more regulations, will leave us a lot of freedom. and that has now also led to important tensions in transatlantic relations. And it's not just, and we have seen that the Trump administration has been putting pressure on the EU also to be more lenient in terms of the implementation of the Digital Services Act, the AI Act. And there is, beyond the issue of different views on regulations, there is also a culture issue that is very important here. And it's an issue of values, and we should also not underestimate that. So in the EU, we indeed and the EU is often referred to as a normative power, and we put a lot of emphasis on human rights and also data protection, privacy, whereas in the US, they, don't take that so seriously as we do. And they say, that our regulation is against free speech. But we in the EU, we try to protect citizens against hate speech, because that is a lot what is happening a lot on social media. And the US says, no, that's all against free speech, and so they are very critical. So it's really an important tension in transatlantic relations. And again, then, there is this concern that they may weaponize, as we call it, this strategic dependence on the US for these technologies.
And I think in general there is a lot of difference in the values, like between the US and Europe. So I think their concerns show as well, because, for example, for the US, hate speech is allowed here. It's not allowed. Yeah. So I think we subconsciously allow AI to control our lives more than it should be. Yeah. So it's for sure important. And as you already mentioned, we wanted to jump a bit more to the social security side. So we wanted to ask you again regarding your research, because we saw that it highlights how the EU had to conform a poly-crisis from the Eurozone crisis to the pandemic. So I think it's very important to touch upon this. And we wanted to ask you, does the way the EU manages these internal shocks, like, for example, the social inequality or health crisis, actually impact our external strength and defense, or do you think it doesn't?
Yeah, no, I think, again, a very interesting question. And indeed, I would fully agree with you that there is a link between the management of internal shocks and our position and our external strength. So if we are weak internally, domestically, then we will also be seen as weak by third parties and third countries. So it's very important that the EU works together to address its domestic challenges, because many of the problems we see today cannot be addressed just by one country. If you think, you also referred to the pandemic, for example, when there was COVID-19, the EU addressed this crisis by buying the vaccines together, jointly. I think that strengthened our position. At this moment, we also have the potential energy crisis with the war in Iran. And so last time when we had such a crisis, when there was the invasion into Ukraine by Russia, there was not enough coordination, and there was even some competition in buying then energy like gas and oil between the EU countries. And so now we are trying to prevent this type of situations. And there is a program that was already established in 2023. It's called Aggregate EU, where parties are coming together and to exchange information, and also try then to come to joint deals, so that you can buy together, so that you're stronger and do not pay the highest price. So, but I fully agree with you that there is a clear link, and so between this internal and external security. And so, in that sense, perhaps in the past there were more clear dividing lines, let's say, boundaries between these two, but these boundaries are increasingly blurred.
And do you think the cooperation in the EU is getting better? Because as we know, in the past there were a lot of complaints that the EU was working kind of slowly, that there was not enough cooperation, and as it gets bigger, it's even worsened. Yeah. But maybe...
Yeah, I think, of course, in periods of crisis, there's always more pressure to work together. And I think if we see what has happened, vis-à-vis Ukraine, Of course, we know that when Hungary was blocking the 90 billion for Ukraine, that is of course not very, very positive. But no, in the end, there is an agreement. The EU is sometimes indeed slow, is sometimes divided, but still, I think when there are these real crises, we hang together, and I think there is also pressure also from public opinion. I think citizens realize very well that, I'm from Belgium, small country, what could we do in today's world? Nothing. But also not even a country like Germany or France, they also realize that they need the European Union to have some weight in the international scene. So in that sense, I'm not too pessimistic, but I think, sometimes I also, I'm disappointed that countries are so much hanging to their own sovereignty, because in the end, everybody loses.
Of course.
Yeah. Do you think it's a hard thing because we have, of course, the EU. However, there's in the EU decentralized power, right? Because every country has its own administrative power. And do you think because of this difficulty is created because we are trying to be a uniform front for situations like this? However, we're not. The decentralized power and I feel like the loyalty people have to their country is sometimes very, very big. Do you think over time we would feel more as European citizens, or that we would still in a couple of years associate more with our own culture? Or do you think this depends per country?
I think it's difficult to predict how it will evolve. So you were already referring to enlargement. So if we further enlarge, there may be even more diversity. And of course, this diversity as such is good. I think Europe should not be kind of, take away this diversity, because we have our own cultures. And this is also means that Europe is a very rich continent.
No, it's very important,
and I think it's also nice to have these differences. And but of course, I think, if we still want to have some role in the future world order, and also I think if we want to protect our European sovereignty, we will have to give up a little bit of our national sovereignty. Yeah. And one issue is, of course, that still in foreign policy, member states want to keep the full grip, and there is unanimity decision making. And I think if we further enlarge, I think that is not feasible anymore. So we will have to give up some of this sovereignty, and there's also talk about groups of coalitions of the willing. Yeah. And we see that already, that in certain areas countries are working more closely together. Sometimes I regret that there is also not more solidarity. Yeah. So that indeed sometimes you give perhaps, but then you will also receive in another situation. So.
So it goes both ways.
And politicians also, I think, they bear a major responsibility, because they also tend to they talk to their domestic public because they want to be re-elected, and they often tend then to blame Brussels, or they also have to say and do certain things. They want to protect their country, but sometimes I think they could do a better job. Why perhaps it's also good to make some concessions or to give something, because you as a country will profit at a later stage. So I think the politicians bear a big responsibility. Yeah. So I think they should be more courageous in defending the EU rather than always blaming it.
Blaming everyone else. I think this is always so super easy to of course, in these situations where there is a lot of constraint, to point a finger, it's not me, but it's you. It's everyone else but me. And I think with this, you create a very much black and white, and it doesn't have to be black and white. No. So I think we should focus on that and having a more gray territory as well. Yeah. And to that last note, we've covered a lot of topics today, and thank you so much for coming. And then I have a bit more of a personal question on that note. So you've said how some things are very messy in the European corporation. However, how could this be solved? And do you think about the students that we have today? Do you see a positive change in these students?
Yeah, I must say that is one of probably the nicest parts of my work, that I work with a lot of young people. And I think sometimes indeed in the current world you would feel a bit depressed by everything that is happening. But then when I see my students, I always have hope, because I see young people who are also well educated, critical about what is happening, and also committed to create a better world. And I think this is very positive. And what I also tell my students always is that, because sometimes they say, well, how do you see the future? And then I always tell them, you have agency. We should not just undergo everything that is happening to us, because then, we are just victims. But we should not be victims. We also have something to say, and we also can act, and we can also fight for a better world. And that I can see a lot in my students as well. Yeah. And that, of course, also gives me courage and hope for the future. Yeah.
As it is the next generation,
exactly.
And they do have the
exactly.
power.
It's very nice to hear. Like, I think the most important thing is to escape this kind of like victim mentality and to kind of be not be scared to make mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes. We grow through mistakes. So
no, and I think we should not be fatalistic, because then, of course, all the bad things will come to us.
Of course.
But if you look, for example, also in the US again, in Minnesota, where people stood up.
Yeah.
And there you can, all together. And then, of course, you have to put limits. And that is the problem. If we just do not react, then, of course, things will happen in a negative direction. Yeah. But I think because many people are not happy with what is happening in the world today, I would say a majority is very unhappy about it. We won't want to see people die in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Iran. And in that sense, I think it's very good to speak up and
So we escape this bystander effect, and we say something, and then of course from that a snowball effect will return, and we can do something.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for this very, very nice advice, Professor Vanhoonacker. I think this was a delightful conversation, and I think also this last perspective on a new generation gave us a bit more hope. So thank you so much for joining us today. And this has been super, super interesting.
No, thanks a lot. And it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone listening to us. This was PES Maastricht Podcast. Until next time.